Dr. Shaffer O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Shaffer O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I think ASA is an absolutely fantastic organisation. Did you know that I helped founded ASA at the first Minding Animals conference in Newcastle? ASA does great work to support animal studies scholars. It also organises a conference every 2 years. The next conference is coming up in New Zealand in 2019, mid-2019. So please think about supporting ASA. ASA does absolutely fantastic work, but it relies on your membership for its capacity to carry out that work. Membership is just $50 Australian, so please think about going over to the ASA website, the Australasian Animal Studies Association website today, and becoming a member. Right, this episode of Minding Animals, yet again, beg your pardon, of Knowing Animals, is coming to you from Minding Animals, which is in Mexico City. And again, I'm very, very lucky to be joined by an eminent animal studies academic who I normally only get to see every couple of years at a conference. So today I'm joined by Professor Brett Mizelle. Have I pronounced that correctly? It's okay. Brett is Professor of History at California State University, and today we're going to discuss Brett's book chapter, Unthinkable Visibility, Pigs, Pork and the Spectacle of Killing and Meat, which appeared in the book Rendering Nature, Animals, Bodies, Places and Politics, which was edited by Shaffer and Young and published by Pennsylvania Press in 2015. Welcome to the podcast, Brett.
It's great to be here.
Brett, can you start by telling us why you wrote this chapter?
This chapter is largely a way of following up on my reaction animal series book, Pig, which was a pretty comprehensive book, but I still had to leave a lot of things out. And so I've been trying to find a way to write every couple of years extensions of the types of work I was doing in that particular human-animal relationship.
Now, you start the chapter by retelling or recounting your experience attending a conference of pig growers. I'm a bit reluctant to use the word farmers because, as you know, in many cases, the animals aren't actually owned by the people who are growing them. And you note that they too seem to have a nostalgic attachment to pigs and traditional farming practices. Can you say something about your experience at that conference?
Yes, one of the things I tried to do with the book is to engage with people in the industry. So I went to, it's very weird events to go to, like the Pork Expo in Des Moines, Iowa. And this happened to be the kind of pork industry forum, and they held it at Disneyland. So since I'm in Long Beach, California, it was just down the street. And I went to their kind of like auction they had one night. And all of the items that they had up were very nostalgic. They were images of, single pigs or the rural countryside. And I kept asking these guys who run the industry, this is not the way your industry works. You have, 10,000 pigs, in confinement facilities. You don't have this. And it was really interesting to see their sense of their own disconnect from this, their own nostalgia, their own, in many ways, regret for what's happened to their business. It was particularly interesting talking there to older guys who said, their children don't go into this business anymore. It used to be farming was a business you kind of felt proud of and you could participate in. But now, like you mentioned, it's contract farming. You don't own the animals. You don't have any real connection to the animals. And so it was interesting to see that even many people within the industry itself see industrial agriculture for meat as a problem.
Mm. So I think it's probably proper that we reserve our greatest empathy for the animals. But after that, do you feel an empathy for the farmers who are involved in this highly structured system?
I do. I do a lot of writing, and my teaching in animal studies is really about kind of questions of multi-species justice and really thinking about the deep entanglements between human and animal. And there are a lot of people to feel sorry for in this situation. I mean, there's an entire generations of people who no longer do the type of work that they found rewarding and, engaging with animals in that period. And then, of course, the other side is the dark side of the workers in the industry itself, many of whom are poor, immigrant, undocumented, and incredibly exploited workers kind of in the United States. And one of the things that I do in one of my classes, in fact, when I teach this article, I also teach a piece about by a writer from the New York Times who talks about kind of the nature of slaughterhouse work. I mean, I asked my students, what would make you more sympathetic to social change, the plight of the animals in the Smithfield plant or the plight of the workers who are being exploited there? And trying to get them to think that it really is an intersectional issue. There's a lot of people here who, are really suffering because of the nature of industrial and intensive meat production.
So, Brett, you note that in a sense, the pig that we know today is a construct and it's a result of human intervention. Can you tell us something about how the wild boar became the factory farmed pig?
Yeah, it's a long process of breeding that's been going on. And one of the things that kind of was a realization I had late in the project, both writing pig, and I'm still thinking about a lot. We had an all-pig conference at Yale University last year, which was really fun, called Pig Out, was that the pig today is just completely different in many ways than the pigs you would have seen in the colonial American period, much less kind of wild pigs, because of so many changes designed to improve their production abilities, right, to produce a certain amount of meat, for example, or a certain ratio of meat to fat. So we really have a very different animal than we used to have at one point. And one of the things I learned from talking to people in the industry is that that's something that kind of bothers them a little bit. The one thing they can't really standardize, they still can't standardize pig bodies enough to automate production systems. What they really want is to automate the slaughterhouse. And the reason the slaughterhouse has so many workers is, in fact, you still need people to do cutting by hand because they can't quite standardize things as much as they would like, even though they've standardized a lot of things. One of my favorite conversations I had with the man who's been the economist for the pork industry for 35 years probably, was he basically said to me, like, I'm kind of glad the one thing we haven't been able to kind of figure out the solution to was seasonal variabilities in breeding. And even it was kind of him saying, I took that as him saying, like, we've basically dominated this animal genetically and physically, but there are still ways in which nature, resists that type of total domination.
Fascinating. So, Brett, pigs weren't always invisible in American society. Can you tell us about a time when it was possible to observe pigs?
It was possible to observe pigs even in my childhood. I just turned 50 this year, and I remember as a kid seeing large farms in Georgia, the American state in the South, where pigs were living outside. And that was something that happened, I think, within people in my generation's memory. But for the most part, no one sees them at all. I mean, one of the things I think about a lot is this question of visibility and invisibility, and that everything is moved into, CAFOs, concentrated animal factory operations. Everything is moved into, confinement for sows or finishing barns, which will have 1,200 or 1,500 pigs in them, but no one really sees them. So you can drive through Iowa now, and you don't really see the animals that outnumber people in that state 5-1. So it's a really interesting thing that I've been really working on a lot, both in the book and in that article. I'm very interested in kind of the ways that pigs are culturally ubiquitous. So we see them as representations everywhere, but they're physically invisible. Like, you don't really see pigs. And I often ask people when I talk about pigs, like, when is the last time you saw a living pig? As opposed to just a picture of one or an image of one, because they really are, for the most part, vanished from the kind of way we would look at them and understand them. So that vanishing, what impact do you think that has had on, say, the life of a pig? Oh, it's huge. It's huge. I think that we don't realize the nature of what's happened within the worlds of animal agriculture because we don't see it. We don't see it. And more than not seeing it, because there's obviously a large literature in animal rights work on the questions of visibility, and visibility is a strategy for social change. We also don't want to see it. I think that, one of the things I think about a lot is I think most people do know. You often hear people talk about, like, well, if slaughterhouses had glass walls. And I keep thinking, no, people would still eat meat. I mean, people find a way to, create some kind of cognitive rupture where they don't have to think about it. But some of it really is interesting, because I think people really would perhaps think differently if they understood that. For example, one of the things I learned that blew my mind is that in America, at least, most pigs are born in North Carolina and in the southern states, and then they're put on trucks when they're basically about 5 to 6 weeks old, and they're shipped about 500,000 pigs a day to the Midwest where the corn is. Basically, it's easier to move the pigs to the corn than the corn to the pigs. And when I learned that there's basically 1 million hogs on the highway every day, 500,000 going to slaughter and 500,000 moving to places to be fed, like that's the type of story that might get people's attention and kind of think like, wait, that's really weird. Why is my food coming from so far away? Why are these piglets being ripped from their mothers so early and being put on trucks and shipped to other kind of states? So I do think there is something important about the politics of visibility in that, and hopefully by seeing more of what's happened to pigs, we would learn more about that. One of the things I'll write about probably in the next kind of follow-up pig piece, of course, is the film Okja, which gets at this kind of question about, what would the industry be doing to create kind of super pigs, and what happens when, the Animal Liberation Front finds them and so forth. It's a great film that gets at a lot of these questions about visibility and how the industry gets away with things.
I've not heard of that film yet.
Oh, you haven't? It's a really wonderful film that came out of Korea, and it's on Netflix, at least in the States, probably as well. And it's a really fascinating film. In fact, I can't wait to stick it in my Animals in American Culture class. It operates on the hypothesis that basically a kind of creepy agricultural producer that really started in chemicals takes kind of mutant pigs, gives them to various farmers to have a competition, like a beauty competition for who can create the best super pig. And the best super pig is raised basically by this grandfather and his granddaughter in Korea. And then they try to bring the pig to New York, but of course it's not going to be a beauty contest. It's going to be, intensive breeding and, terrifying things kind of happen. And it's a great kind of adventure story. It's one of the few great films I can think about animal rights people and, pigs and pork production. It's dynamite, yeah.
Could you say the name again more slowly for listeners?
Yes, it's a Okja, O-K-J-A.
Oh.
So just 4 letters. So yeah, it's a really wonderful film that, in fact, raises a lot of these questions about genetics, modification, the need to feed people, the steps the industry takes to kind of hide what they're doing or to try to cloak it through humane washing, green washing. And then it's really about the lives of pigs. It's a beautiful film for the relationship between this gigantic, it's probably the size of an elephant, this gigantic super pig and this young girl.
Mm. Now, Brett, my PhD and then subsequently my monograph, Animals, Equality and Democracy, was a lot about visibility. And my PhD was examined by Robert Garner, and he and I have a debate that I don't think either of us have acquiesced to the other just yet, about the role animal activists play in raising visibility. And so my kind of hypothesis is that given that we can't see what's happening, we can't have just public policy. And his view is that animal activists have educated the community about what's happening. There's been so much footage and information shared that kind of isn't the excuse. We do actually know. But in your book chapter, you argue that the industry is aware that people are learning and responding, and they're trying to respond to that concern. Can you say something about that dynamic of growing concern for pigs and the industry's response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that was most fascinating about working with people and talking to people at the National Pork Board, which is the big lobby group for the pork industry in the United States, was how aware they are of what people are doing. They really are aware of the battles they have to face against public opinion about the way animals are raised, about the quality of the food, about the nature of the food. One of the funny stories that I love about pigs in America, at least, was that pigs were the number one consumed meat in most of American history, really until the post-World War II period, and really, in fact, until the 1970s and 80s when chicken took over. So the pork industry at one point decides to make pork the other white meat. And now, of course, there's been a backlash against meat that doesn't have any flavor. So that when I was at this press conference that they did, basically rebranding cuts of pork like the same cuts they give to cuts of steak. Right. So, they're very aware of, they do a lot of marketing. What do consumers want? What are the consumer trends in terms of foodie culture, in terms of restaurants? What are kind of activists doing? How can they really kind of pitch things kind of as more humane? And they're also responding to actual really, I think, progressive legislative efforts. There was an initiative in Arizona, initiative in California banning gestation crates and other forms of the treatment of animals. So they're on the defensive in that sense, but they are very, very good and sophisticated, I think, at kind of spinning the discussion and really kind of turning the discussion in certain ways. So they are certainly someone to an industry to really think about how they handle that. And there are other groups in the United States as well which are even more powerful at that. There's a kind of a larger meat lobbying organization that is much creepier and a little more sinister in the way that they kind of approach questions of animal activism and animal welfare and animal rights work.
So what I'm hearing, I guess, is that there's not a sincere response to try to make the lives of pigs better, but effort going into making it seem as though it's better. Is that right?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think it's both at the same time. They have been trying to take steps, but those steps are taken. It's hard to tell. I mean, are they fundamentally taken for public relations? Probably. I mean, I would say they're probably weighted more for the PR value than for the actual value is one of those issues that they're really working on.
So if you gaze into your crystal ball, what do you see as the future for the pig in America?
No, it's a great question. I think that I have several visions, really. One of them is an incredibly dark one, and I kind of think, and one of the things that Jonathan Shaffer and Phoebe S.K says in Eating Animals, is that ultimately, ecologically and environmentally, the meat industry will be destroyed. In other words, there will be some outbreak, epidemic, something related to that because of just the horrific conditions in which these animals are kept, and then all of the environmental issues that follow that, such as water pollution, air pollution, and so forth. So that's kind of one of my senses, that there may just become a moment when people are like, ugh, and people will die. I mean, something will happen because of the nature of the meat that's being produced in the United States that will lead to kind of a change in the industry. The flip side is a really pessimistic vision, which is that I'm not sure things are going to change. I mean, I think that there's been a lot. I mean, this conference has been really wonderful for that. I particularly love Joanne MacArthur's talk at dinner a couple nights ago, where it was very positive and optimistic, and we were, and many great things have happened. But it is a big industry, and I think people ultimately, at least my experience in writing Pig and writing a lot of these follow-up pieces, is Americans just will go for cheap meat. I mean, there's a group of people who are willing to pay for different meat, and that's an awesome alternative for a lot of people. If you're going to be a person who eats pigs, there are alternatives, but for the most part, it's a race to the bottom. It's a race to see how things can be cheaper and cheaper, and I'm not sure how we combat that. I'm still not sure I've seen the right solution to that.
Well, I interviewed Philip a little while ago, and he's written one of the reaction books, and he was writing about sheep, which, as an Australian, I'm prejudiced to think of as a quintessential New Zealand animal. And he was saying that, to his shame, he didn't have any sheep friends when he started the book, but he did make some sheep friends before he finished writing it. Did you have an empathy or a special relationship with pigs before you started?
Yeah, that's a great question. They've always been probably my favorite animal since I was a kid. Even my mom found stuff in the garage, when we were cleaning up my mom's house as she was moving, like, stuffed pig toys and things like that. I got really into pigs partly because my original work, my dissertation work, was about animal exhibitions. So I wrote originally quite a bit about kind of the prehistory of exhibitions before the circus and the zoo. And I was very interested. The key animal for me, in fact, still is the pig of knowledge. And this was a pig that could spell and tell time and do math. And it was an international sensation in the 1780s and 1790s. And so I've been thinking for a long time about the capacities of pigs. Pigs are amazing animals. They're really, really interesting. And I try to spend as much time with them as possible. So I have a couple pig friends I get to spend time with when I'm in Texas at a rescue there. And so I spend a lot of time with Pearl. And then in terms of the alternative industrial side, one of the people I've become close to is Jude Becker, and he runs Becker Lane Organic Pork in Iowa. And he's trying to basically raise pigs in a completely alternative system. And he's done so in such a way that the pigs live outside. The sows stay with their piglets in these kind of Quonset huts. The end of the pigs is still the same, which is terrible, but it's one of the only places I can think of in America where you can go to his farm, you can walk onto the farm, you can talk to Jude, and you can sit out in the field surrounded by very curious, very adorable piglets who will come up to you. And, it's really kind of wonderful to have those types of moments. Again, they're complete exceptions. But there's a lot of great work being done in sanctuaries and so forth where you can see a lot of pigs and get to know them better. I wish I could know them more, but living in Los Angeles, it's hard to have any kind of non-human animal companion.
Well, if you do come to the ASA conference in New Zealand in 2019 and you have time to pop across to Australia, you must go to Edgars Mission. It's in Victoria, and Edgar was one of the many pigs used in Babe, filming Babe, one of the pig actors in Babe. And Pamela Hearn has created this amazing sanctuary around this issue of starting with Edgar and building out from there. So I think you'd really enjoy that.
I would love that. Yeah, I think sanctuaries are really important, and I thought a lot, especially at this conference. I thought some of the things that came up in the panel on disposability and kind of thinking about the importance of the sanctuary, both as a kind of physical space, but also kind of a space of kind of recognition of the worth of particular animals is really important.
Now, Brett, I ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am ready.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I can, and it's a really great story. I'll try to keep it brief, but I was in college doing a lot of activist work related to kind of race and gender in Washington, D.C. I went to Georgetown University, and I heard about this new book by this woman, Carol Adams, called The Sexual Politics of Meat, and I went to a bookstore and I bought it. And I remember, and I've told Carol this story, that people kind of laughed at me, like, what's this thing, like, ha-ha, like, what can you possibly mean there's a connection between, like, speciesism and sexism? So that, in fact, is the first really text that I remember reading. And a couple of years ago, I did a talk with Carol Adams and brought that original copy that I had from so forth. And it was really great. It was a great story. So that really was kind of the first piece I remember reading and really thinking about. And it's still a very important work for me in getting at the intersectionality, which I think is the great struggle for all of us, really, is how do we thinking about multi-species justice and the intersectionalities of the way power works on human and non-human bodies alike.
Fantastic. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I can. So I was in graduate school doing the dissertation I mentioned about exhibitions of exotic and performing animals in early America. And it was a piece about exhibitions of monkeys and apes and how people would go see those shows and think about and use them to comment about ideas of race and racial formation. And so it was kind of an early piece for me, both in thinking about, again, intersectionality, but also thinking about the nature of animals in captivity and animals in performance.
Fantastic. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I'm going to squeeze in two very quickly. The first has to be Harriet Ritvo, because when I was starting in the 1990s doing animals in history, there was almost no one doing that work. And Harriet has just been so important and so generative in terms of kind of basically creating the field and legitimacy of studying non-human animals within history. The other person is Donna Haraway. I think so much and love so much of Donna's works over the last 30, 40 years, in particular that idea of staying with the trouble. I'm very interested in the way that she helps us think through the complex power relations that bind all of us together.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
There are a lot of things academics can do. Part of it is teaching. I think a real big emphasis of this conference and in my own work has been teaching courses and working with the public through public events to educate them about, for example, the nature of the pig and why we should think about pigs differently than perhaps we do. It was a really big part of it. I think the other big part academics can do is to raise questions when the answers seem too easy. And one of the things I think that I've liked about this conference, there have been a lot of really good challenges to a lot of kind of binary thinking and kind of very what I would call kind of standard, like this is the right type of activism, this is the wrong type of activism, or the industry is always bad, or scientists are always bad, to kind of complicate those things, to stay with the trouble again, I think is what we can do.
Wonderful. So Brett, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think I'd like to find a way to get people to have more contact with the animals that they think they know. I guess I'm now doing another project about a different animal, which we'll talk about in a minute. And kind of like the pig project, people think they know what these animals are like and they don't. And then finding a way to do that, I think, could create some really interesting forms of change. People would recognize that there's something about these animals that's different than the expectations created for them by our culture.
And Brett, finally, what are you working on next?
So I'm working on two projects at once. The other animal I was just mentioning is squirrels. So I'm doing the squirrel book for Reactions Animal Series. It should be out hopefully at the end of this year. And that's been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot about the more than 200 species of Sciuridae in the world. And then the other project I'm working on is a more traditional academic book. It's got the terribly long title right now of The Making and Taking of Animal Life in the 19th Century United States. But I'm trying to write a comprehensive book about a key moment when everything really changes for non-human animals in terms of the way they're created, the way they're bred, the way they're slaughtered, marketed, etc.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to seeing that, and hopefully one day I'll be able to interview you again about your new work. How can people find out more about your work, Brett?
I can be found on Twitter, so I'm just at Brett Mizelle, B-R-E-T-T, and then M-I-Z-E-L-L-E. And because I'm lucky to have a relatively unique name, just stick my name in anything and it pops up, and the various books and articles pop up all over the place.
Fantastic. Well, Brett, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals.
You're welcome.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. We also have a Facebook page, which is Knowing Animals. And finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.